So welcome to the School Cities Symposium on Climate Justice and Cities. My name is Karen Chappell, and I'm Director of the School of Cities and Professor of Geography and Planning at UT. So I'm thrilled to be welcoming you here to Massey College for an exciting day of research, presenting the work of our Urban Challenge grantees on this important issue of climate and justice. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. This symposium is virtual, and we're not all gathered in the same place, so I want to recognize that this land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you're actually on right now. So we ask, if this is the case, you acknowledge the territory that you are on and the current treaty holders. We also want to acknowledge the many broken promises and treaties and the need to work towards reconciliation with the original caretakers of Turtle Island, both in the present and for future generations. And we'd like to acknowledge those of us who came here involuntarily, particularly as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And so we honor and pay tribute to the ancestors of African origin and descent. So we're gathered here today to learn about climate, justice, and cities. We decided to focus on this issue at the School of Cities for a couple reasons. First, Canadian researchers are doing leading work globally on climate science, but there's little attention paid to issues of equity and disparate impacts, and also to cities. Second, we have a fabulous emerging cluster of faculty at the U of T who are engaged in climate and justice research, and we wanted to support their work. And third, most importantly, Canada is lagging behind when it comes to climate action. We aren't meeting our targets. We don't have realistic plans to meet them. And unlike the rest of the world, we don't even have a coherent research program on climate that also engages communities. So, the Urban Challenge Grant Program. Our program is multidisciplinary scholarly communities of practice within the U of T around complex urban challenges. The grants fund timely research and provide seed funding for pilot studies that could ultimately lead to transformative or high-impact research. We ask just two things of our grantees. We want them to co-create research designs and engage with their stakeholders, and we want them to mobilize knowledge so it doesn't stay within the ivory tower. This grant program, a competitive process, led to the award of $577,100 in grants for 2022 to 23 to teams representing over 20 departments across the 3 campuses of U of T. Each initiative focused on a different aspect of climate change and its impact on urban spaces and disadvantaged groups. Each team connects closely to policymakers and stakeholders. I'd like to hand it over now to our MC for the day, Lara Muldoon, our Senior Partnerships, Engagements, and Projects Officer, who'll be keeping us on track all day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karen, and good morning, everyone. Both joining us here in person and online, as Karen said, my name is Lara Muldoon, and I lead the Partnerships and Outreach portfolio here at the School of Cities. I am so delighted to be with you here today and welcome you. And before we begin and get to the real show, I just want to share a couple of notes to help keep us organized. The symposium is fully hybrid, as Karen mentioned, so we're welcoming everybody online, and you will have many opportunities to engage both online and in person today. So keep your eye on that Q&A box. You can access the full symposium program online through our website or by scanning one of the QR codes that are at the registration desk and located around the room on these handy cards. And then we'll have 3 panels this morning before lunch. We'll give you a little break in between. And we'll reconvene this afternoon for keynote presentations, the final panel, and a reception. Coffee and water are available all day just around the corner. And if you need a place to work, there's a private dining room upstairs that you can take a call or work quietly, as well as the dining room is available. So in just a moment, I'm going to invite the first group of panelists up to the stage. If you have any questions for our panelists, please wave to one of our helpful volunteers positioned around the room. They're waving right now. And then there's also somebody online, Tony, that will be taking your questions online. And you will pass your questions. You could write them out, try to write as well as you can be legible. And then they will pass them to our moderators who will ask our panelists. There'll also be some networking breaks throughout the day where you can follow up with any one of our panelists or discussants who will be hopefully joining us for the rest of the day. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce the first panel, and I'm going to hand the mic back over to Karen, who will actually be moderating this panel in place of Professor Kate Mulligan, who is today, unfortunately. Thank you, and I hope you all enjoy this inspiring event.
Thanks, Lara. So I'm delighted to welcome this panel. We're missing Kate. I'm the substitute teacher today, but Kate actually worked with the group to prepare. So thank you, Kate, wherever you are. I'll introduce our panelists. First, we have Lief Pagalan. Lief represents a research team from the Dalla Lana School of Public Health, led by Professor Laura Rosella and Jeffrey Pong Chen, Andy Hong, and others. So Lief will be reflecting on his grant, which was predicting the impact of climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies on premature deaths in Canadian urban centers. Next, we have Karen Smith. Karen's at the end here. Karen also represents a large team of researchers, completely multidisciplinary. Actually, we married this team. We were like, you guys got to work together. So we put Professor Smith together with Professors Roland Alexander from Information and Stats and Professor Monica Alexander from Stats and Sociology. And Karen's team also already had Professor William Goff from Physical Environmental Sciences, Samantha, and then there was Samantha Green, Edward G.I. Tozer, Micah Hewer, so big team also from UTSC and St. George. Their grant is Climate Change, Extreme Heat, and Human Mortality in the City of Toronto. Then we have Amanda next to Lief. Amanda is representing a research team that is led by Professor Matt Adams. Amanda is at the Department of Geography, Geomatics, and Environment at UTM, as is Professor Adams. And they're working with a set of geography professors from across the campuses at U of T. And their work is on air quality and environmental justice, the growing impact of climate change on disproportionate air quality exposure. Then we're delighted to be welcoming Professor Priyanka DeSouza, international discussant. So Priyanka is an assistant professor at University of Colorado, Denver in urban and regional planning, where she investigates different approaches to air pollution and its effects and studies thereof. She has her early degrees from IIT Bombay, then an MBA from the University of Oxford, and then was at the Science Division of the Environment in Nairobi for a year, and then went to the Sensible City Lab at MIT, and then was a PhD student at MIT, and has many other credits. So thank you so much for joining us, and I'll kick off the panel at this point and join you guys on the seats. Incredible, complex data sets. So how can data-driven approaches help cities plan for and mitigate the disparate impacts of climate change on at-risk communities? Who wants to start? I'm going to pick on you different ones to start each time.
I can start.
Thank you, Lief.
I think with this project, we were able to harness vast amounts of data. And for example, like on the population side, we have population level surveys, we have administrative data, we have medical records. And on the environmental side, we have things like remote sensing, air pollution models, and like urban level sensors. But what we notice is that we need a little bit more granularity in this type of data. And the reason for that is because we know the impacts of climate change are very much unevenly distributed. And cities are also very heterogeneous. So the data that we need more neighborhood level data. We need data that captures segments of the population that are at higher risk from these threats. And I would say that if we really want to develop solutions that are place-based, that are equitable, and that are socially contextual, it's really important to have this richness of data. And I think in the future, I think the opportunities we have is creating new types of data sets. So our research focused very much in preventing deaths related to climate change. But I think on the other extreme, we can also focus on things that promote health and well-being. We can ask questions of what makes your community thrive and what makes your community flourish. And that of social and well-being data is rarer and also a little bit difficult to capture, and I think that's where opportunities currently exist. I also think that it's important to remember that cities are also social systems, and this type of like social and well-being data also is able to capture social capital and social relationships that are really key to sustainable development and climate adaptation that sometimes existing data doesn't capture.
I could go next. So I think that the data-driven approaches kind of provide like strong evidence for communities if there are inequities, which is the first step in identifying and mitigating inequities. So if we come to them and provide them with the evidence, they have the agency to prepare themselves and be aware of their environmental exposures, as well as make the decision to live within them or move outside of them.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just give a little brief overview of what we worked on to give you a sense of the data types we were dealing with. So for our project, what I was working on was related to kind of mapping heat vulnerability across the city. And so this involved using surface temperature data from remote sensing data, so some geophysical data sets, but then we were also combining those with different demographic data sets, census data, then using some open data from the City of Toronto related to canopy cover, what's this, impervious surfaces, things like that. So we were working with, I would say size data. And one of the goals of our project, I think, kind of related to data-driven approaches was to use publicly available data so that this type of project could be reproducible. And so what we find when we kind of combine these different data sets together using various kind of statistical techniques is we do see kind of spatially across the City of Toronto that heat vulnerability is not evenly distributed. Not a big surprise, perhaps, but it doesn't exactly match, the heat distribution. So vulnerability, combined with these socioeconomic factors, it doesn't map exactly to just looking at temperature. So combining these different data sets together does give us some additional insights. And so we see that, you know, addressing climate change, so in implementing adaptation efforts will need to kind of address these inequalities that we see across the city, the climate injustice, and then as, you know, as a knock-on effect, potentially health impacts, heat exhaustion, heat stroke, these types of things. So I do want to also emphasize that this type of work is not new. You know, this type of analysis around heat vulnerability has been done in different cities, in Toronto in the past as well. But as climate change kind of continues to accelerate and the impacts become more acute, this is the type of project where we need to kind of keep updating the results. So having quickly available data sets and very simple approaches to doing this type of mapping was kind of part of our motivation around this project. And so just maybe a little example from 2021, BC, the BC heat dome, to put some of this in context for all of us. So, you know, it was extremely hot, right? It was 40 degrees and higher in a lot of the area across the Pacific Northwest, but kind of focusing. And there were, I think the BC Coroner's report said around 619 heat-related deaths. But, you know, when we talk about vulnerability, we're looking at, you know, 2/3 of those were 70 years of age or older. I think more than 80% had some other chronic illnesses. And I think more than half were people living alone. So these are some of those vulnerability pieces that come from the census data that we kind of integrate with temperature. So yeah, maybe I'll pass it along and we can continue the conversation.
Okay. I should mention that Priyanka will speak at the end. So she's in here to listen in, and then we give her a full 15 minutes to comment on everything that we say. So we'll be focusing on our three researchers. So tell us a little bit about the opportunities and challenges you've faced in co-creating data sets, because all of you are mentioned working with stakeholders or working with diverse sources of data that involve external folks. Do you want to start, Amanda?
Oh, okay. So I would say like the opportunities that are created are like alignment with both like other disciplines. So kind of like gathering the different research components from each discipline into one makes our argument stronger. And in this alignment, we've also started to see that our patterns are maybe not unique. So our research looks to identify like at-risk populations for air pollution exposure in the Peel region, which is the region directly west of Toronto. And we found that individuals are not necessarily vulnerable communities are at a higher risk of exposure, but they're also never given immunity, perhaps, to live in areas with cleaner exposure for whatever reason. But this has been found in other studies in Ontario. So so this is an opportunity for us to kind of bridge disciplines, look across the research that's been done, and see if there's broader patterns in Canada. And then in terms of challenges, the spatial and temporal alignment of these different data sets is time consuming, to least. So for our research project, we started by just writing our paper on 2016 census data and integrating air pollution data from CANU, actually here at University of Toronto. But we're planning to actually do a time series analysis using about 5 consecutive years of census data. Actually, I think it's 7. And so that really introduces a new topic, as Canada didn't consistently collect the same variables across time. So you have to map that way, and then you also need to map the variables temporally. So identifying time points of interest and how you want to align them.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, we were kind of working with mostly publicly available data sets. So these were kind of already out there in the world. But one aspect of our project did look at kind of distinguishing tower communities from sort of the City of Toronto at large. And this stemmed from some workshops that we participated in with the Centre for Connected Communities, which is a not-for-profit organization who works with tower communities. And so we were really interested in kind of getting a better sense of are these tower communities more vulnerable to heat than sort of the city at large. And there's a lot of variability across these communities. Some of them are located, you know, very close to these ravine networks and have access to green spaces, and then others are not. But overall, we did see that that these tower communities were at greater risk of heat vulnerability. So that's one aspect where we kind of worked with community to look at a particular problem related to the data we were working with.
And similarly, with as Karen's project, for us, we used open data that was already collected. I think the idea of co-creating data is incredibly challenging, and not merely from like a technological standpoint, but also social, especially when we are working alongside communities who have been marginalized. And I think a lot of questions come up about the data infrastructure. So it's not just the data alone. So what does it mean to collect data from communities that are already high risk, already low resources, and how do you build relationships that are not extractive but also reciprocal?
Yeah, so you guys, a lot of you are using existing data sets but you want to be working closely with cities and city stakeholders in the process. So I'm wondering if how that work, how your work, how the research work can be kind of co-created with those researchers. So, you know, what new capacities do you find that cities would need in order to be kind of sharing and truly participating in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, maybe I can. Yeah, that's a great question. And we've, you know, started some of these conversations with different groups. And, you know, I think I come from the climate science side of things, very much, you know, familiar with climate models and geophysical climate data, and there is a lot of expertise working with like GIS type of data within the city. But I think when it comes to climate change and climate projections in particular, there's a lot of limitations with the data, and maybe that's an area you could collaborate and help to build capacity around. What can climate models tell us about what's coming versus what they can't tell us about what's coming? How can we use this data to think about things maybe in a scenario-driven way rather than a prescriptive or predictive way? Can we think about potential scenarios, compound events, you know, what happens if we have a heat wave and we have a blackout at the same time? These kinds of sort of using a creative dimension as well as just sort of strictly data-driven approaches.
I would say that we can also use this data to kind of guide policymakers on where mitigation approaches are needed most. So for example, if we find a high density of air pollution, we can develop strategies around that, such as green walls or also low emission zones to kind of mitigate that and reduce the exposure for at-risk communities.
Before I let you speak, I just want to rephrase the question, because we're the school cities, and I like to say that we teach the world why cities matter, and we do aspire to be working on capacity building as one of our strategic priorities. So if we hired you to do a course on climate and justice, you know, what would you do for cities?
I think, specifically for this panel, we're talking about how we can use data and harness it, and specifically for cities. And I think there's a very big opportunity to actually not think about data creation as a one-time off thing. And I think we need to invest in data and technological structures. So we're talking about continuously collecting data, so it's going. We need to have data warehouses where the data is being processed, and we also need to facilitate the ability to create linkages with this data so it's open and researchers can access it and actually create really interesting models, as the other panelists were talking about. And I think like up-to-date data for a city is absolutely critical. I think especially when we're building models that are influencing policy, data needs to be up to date. You know, in the past years, we know that this is really important if you want to have a proactive strategy in the face of a health emergency. This is a requirement. So I think also that data is part of a much broader technological system. Obviously, we collect data because they're going into some kind of algorithm or some kind of model. And the more risk that is associated with this technology, there needs to be bigger obligations with that technology that you're working on. So I think cities and policymakers really have a role in terms of regulating this new age of like data, artificial intelligence, and machine learning. We need to think about data at the design stage in terms of what are the potential benefits and harms. We need to think about development of these technological systems, what are its intended uses and what are its limitations, and even when we deploy it in the field, you know, how have we developed risk mitigation strategies, and also are we continuously monitoring it to make sure that it doesn't go off the rails?
Yeah. Yeah, I was wondering how long it would take us to raise AI. Every conversation I've been in the last month, AI has come up, and so here we are 15 minutes into the conference and already on it. So good. So what's so great about this panel is you guys are from three very different disciplines. So Karen's from climate science, Amanda's a geographer, and Lief is from health. And so what can you learn from merging data sets from these different disciplines? Let me put this another way. Like if you had your dream data set from another discipline, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe this is a question for Lief. So one of the things that we were hoping to do this past year that we just kind of got a little bogged down with the kind of I guess technical aspects was looking at health data. So we used a lot of data in our analysis of heat vulnerability as proxy data for underlying health conditions, right? So based on the research, you know, communities that maybe are lower income also tend to have more underlying health conditions, that sort of thing, right? So we use these as a proxy data. But we didn't actually use the health data. And so this was a challenge that we found in our group, but I know Lief is working with this data all the time. So that would be, I think, something really valuable for what we've done, because we've created these heat vulnerability maps, but we haven't actually validated this map, right? It's based on, as I said, these socio-demographic data, but we haven't actually validated it. So that's an important piece, right? There's limitations to what these kind of data-driven approaches can provide us. They can give us, okay, maybe this is a map of heat vulnerability, but we actually need to go and do the extra step of validating what we've come up with. So that would be my dream data set, is to try to have that data to validate. Mm-hmm.
I guess I would say my dream set, if you will, would be at the individual level. I think that's all what we're like working towards as well. Like we can only get so far with ecological data, making guesses about populations. And then specifically with air pollution vulnerability, I think we start to, there are like so many factors that impact how air pollution is inhaled or ingested, and so you start to get to like medical field, like you know, as well as all these other disciplines, sociology, like public health, what adverse events have impacted these people and how are they going to experience air pollution. So I guess my ideal data set would be individuals and their entire life history, probably. If I could just have that, I think we'd be great.
I absolutely agree with Amanda. I mean, I would love individual level data where we can calculate exposures from like conception to death. We know like life course is very important, and of course I would love this data without the complications of privacy. I think, as Karen mentioned, like with AI and machine learning, these new technologies can ingest so much information. I would love types of data, whether it's like economic, environmental, health, population, and I think there's a lot of talk about these technologies maturing and these data sources becoming more abundant, creating basically digital twin cities where we can have live data, create simulations, and forecast different scenarios so we can plan for them.
Yeah. By the way, we're going to get to questions very soon, so start to fill out your question cards and send them out. So this raises the question of ethics. So I just want to jump to that. Yes, we would all love complete individual life histories and with detailed information about your relationships, your culture, your family history, medical history, and so forth. So, but what are the ethical considerations when we use that kind of data?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's certainly privacy concerns, right? And yeah, so what we're doing all the time is we're doing some type of averaging, and we kind of just have to accept that that's the reality. So we're not going to be able to get that individual level data, and I think that's right. Like, you know, I appreciate my privacy as an individual as well. So. But we can work with communities, you know, to get a better sense of the concerns of individuals, right? So we may not be able to just harness that data and plug it into an AI system that has all its biases and all these types of things, right? We have to be completely aware of those limitations. But so we can engage with community, can, you know, hear about their priorities, maybe not individual needs, but yeah. So yeah, maybe others have their thoughts as well.
Yeah, and if you could bring up also spatial concerns, you know.
Yeah. Okay, so I think in terms of ethical concerns, even at the community level, the implications of your research need to be carefully considered, and also how you communicate it. As scientists, like, I personally might not be the best person to tell a community what's going on in their community, or you know, how to fix it. So it's like identifying those stakeholders that can come across and communicate problems to them, and also like providing the information in a way that's accessible for everyone. So one thing our team has been doing is working with a science communication club here at U of T to kind of build an illustration that can be like distributed to communities. But even then, like, I think the weight of our communication needs to be carefully considered. And then, yeah, when we're considering individual level data, of course, like, privacy is like of the utmost importance, and so you know, it would be ideal, but we do the best with what we can, and yeah, but when we're aggregating spatially, then we start to introduce biases. And so we need to kind of consider these biases and communicate them as well, because we're just making our best estimate.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good question. I think that conversation is happening rapidly. I know I keep on mentioning artificial intelligence, but it really casts a very low shadow, especially on data as like one of the core components of that algorithmic pipeline. And even now, we're having more conversations, which is good. In Canada, of course, we have the proposed Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, which is building a lot of frameworks and regulations for us to develop these new technologies. And I think one thing to really emphasize is really the need for regulation to ensure safety, and that the data they use and that these technologies are very much aligned to our social values. I think the four critical issues that come to mind is, of course, safety, making sure that we're mitigating the risk of any harm to our populations and cities. I think of fairness and equity when we talk about vulnerable populations, ensuring that we don't perpetuate discrimination and inequity. I also think about accountability. So this is determining who has ethical and legal obligations behind this data. And I think another important issue is governance, this question of who owns data. So who should own data about the public? Is it the public who generated the data, or is it a private company who aggregated it? Where do we go from there?
Oh, these are all really great questions. Thank you. Great responses. And so makes me think about the issue of cities and how cities are going to govern this mess that we're in. And a particularly challenging time for cities. And so actually, a little commercial, the School of the Environment, along with the cities, is sponsoring a mayoral debate, asking the mayoral candidates about their issues on climate in particular. And hopefully that debate will have some focus on justice and what the city is actually going to do. Channeling your advice here for our poor mayoral candidates, how would you cities move forward in an evidence-informed way on climate action and justice?
Well, I'm not a policy person at all, so this is and this is just kind of related to my experience with the HEAT project, but there's, all sorts of ways that, the city can plan and think about benefits in terms of their planning around adaptation and mitigation. So there's, clear targets around mitigation for the city, and there's, the Toronto resilience strategy around some adaptation efforts and how can those align. And I think the city has done a good job with the resilience strategy to identify ways that those things align. And so to just kind of carry that effort forward, right? So around, green spaces, trees suck up CO2 and provide shade and cooling. And so these are ways to kind of think about synergies between adaptation and mitigation. But we are going to have to think seriously about cooling, artificial cooling, and how that's going to come into the policy framework. Are there going to be regulations around temperature thresholds for cooling? That's certainly something that we're going to have to have a bigger discussion about across the city and across all over the world. So that's my thoughts.
I think also like an open dialogue with the communities and the researchers. So somewhere where we can all kind of come together and kind of discuss ongoing issues. Like this needs to be an ongoing conversation that, adapts as climate change increases.
After professing love of data, I would also say on the other end is like, do we really need data? How much evidence do we need that air pollution is bad? How much evidence do we need that climate change is a major risk? Data will always be incomplete. It will be imperfect. And despite of us wanting to build very sophisticated models, sometimes we just need to act. It might be imperfect, but we need to act with urgency.
Okay, great advice. So our audience has been very forthcoming, and I have a number of questions for you. So thank you, guys. I got a set related to communities, so I'm going to start with 3 questions combined, and you guys can pick to answer any aspect of this. So the first person says, how do you deal with communities, municipalities who are hesitant to share data? This could be for concerns like vulnerability, can lower property values, et cetera. How to make the best case for data sharing. And then comments on the strengths or limitations of using participatory approaches to data generation, like citizen science. And then a question on how can cities work to collect data from communities more easily, data on social and well-being?
Sorry.
Okay.
For the last question, I can think of one distinct example. Marinia Kolak at University of Illinois Chicago is doing this with COVID, and she kind of created a website where people could just add comments or their experiences, write about whatever they wanted in relation to COVID-19. And I realize that climate change is a bit different, but I think, hearing people's experiences of climate change might really help us understand how people are experiencing it or if it's a concern. For them, of course it's a concern, but if you're experiencing food insecurity or something, are you thinking about it, or how are you thinking about it? And then I think citizen science, on to the second question, kind of related to that, that citizen science is about how you're experiencing something and then wanting to make a change from that. So I think it's great, and I think that it should be supported, and we have the knowledge of the frameworks that need to be provided to conduct great research, but they have the passion for a question, so it's great to support that. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just comment on the citizen science aspect, because this is certainly something that we've been thinking about, and this came up in one of our roundtables earlier in the year, that there's this difference between outdoor heat vulnerability and indoor heat vulnerability, and so we have been thinking about how can we leverage maybe apps or these kinds of things to get a better sense of the lived experience inside some of these tower communities. Example. But yeah, it's something we're still kind of exploring, but I think there's lots of opportunity to make use of different types of apps and that sort of thing for citizen science data collection. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think cities have, in my experience, have been incredible at sharing data with open data portals. I think there's another source of data that has remained untapped, and we can also think about private companies who have so much of our data unbeknownst to us. And I think there's an opportunity to really push the redefinition of what is public data. If I generate this data, does it belong to me? If my community generates this data, does this data belong to my community? And by reframing what is public, how can we use it for public good? Whether it's allowing us to download our data and share it with people who are doing citizen science, or creating data that's interoperable so we can move it through different technological systems. I think those are the opportunities that exist that are currently untapped.
Great. And so a couple questions actually ask you to go even deeper on this issue. Apparently there's some comments online that there hasn't been enough discussion of the impacts on at-risk communities in particular. And someone from the audience here asks, can you share more on how to address gaps or bias in these data sets? Where we know some communities are not sufficiently represented due to marginalization or lack of trust.
I'd be happy to answer that question. And I think in our project, equity was a very important consideration. And what we found is that data can be sparse. And what happens if people are not in your data, they will not be counted. We can't estimate what the effects will be for them. And I think this really goes back into the importance of data collection and governance, how we collect this data in ways that are equitable, in ways that are ethical.
I can think of one big example in Canada is Indigenous populations and the census. So Indigenous populations are historically underrepresented in the census. There's quite a bit of distrust with the government. And I think when you're considering that, they're certainly an at-risk population. And how do we work with them to make them feel safe when they're being studied? Because there's a reason that they don't feel safe. And so just considering that and considering the history when we data, but also, it's an even bigger ask when we're using their data. So, everything that we can do to create assurances that we're trying to help is important.
Yeah, and I think this just highlights that I think we often feel that we have lots of data. We can just crunch the numbers. There's tons of data, but there are lots of gaps, right? And so sometimes we have limited data around certain things. What we've done with our project is to collaborate with a not-for-profit group to try to, at least on a micro scale, talk with certain tower communities. There's the whole city that we've only kind of spoken with a few different groups. So there's certainly more work to do to engage directly with these communities and that aren't maybe represented in all the data sets we're using.
So one more data question, and then I have a few impact questions from the audience here. So one person comments, individual data is scary. Do we need that much depth, perfection in data? Would 80%, for instance, be enough to actually bring about policy change?
Yeah, I think Lief kind of touched on this earlier, that how much data do we need? I think we already know enough, and as a climate scientist, we've known enough for a long time. I think that's maybe a question for policymakers, to think about, do we have enough to act on at this point? Do we? No, I don't think we need individual data, for example, right? Like, I think some of the aggregated data gives us enough information to make decisions now, for sure.
Absolutely. I think data is quite alluring, but data is not the end goal, and we should not be distracted. If we want to address climate change, again, the data will be imperfect. We'll never be able to capture everything.
Mm-hmm. I would say even if you were to use individual level data, it wouldn't capture everything. I don't think it's necessary for this question, especially. We have so much evidence. Mm-hmm. But I think, as we move forward in research, and with the amount of data collection that goes on, even every day, I think it's important to consider how concerned people are.
Okay, so to the question of impact, one of our members asked what is actually needed for research to collaborate better with cities. Then Joanna, our colleague, asked, what are the challenges you face when delivering the results of these analyses to policymakers and trying to support them in applying the information to policies that have real-life impacts?
Yeah, I guess so. We're still kind of going through that process, and as I mentioned before, this is as a climate scientist, this is my first kind of project where I've kind of looked at things from a direct policy angle. So we're still kind of working through that. We're talking to the city about ways that, for example, our heat vulnerability maps can be integrated into different activities that they're undergoing. So I'm actually here to learn about how best to engage, for sure.
I think we're in a similar position. We're still you
guys are modest.
In the weeds about that a little bit, but I think we are trying to collaborate and develop communications that are accessible, and I think that's really important in getting our message across.
Yeah, I agree. I think oftentimes we focus on knowledge translation. We want to make sure we collaborate early on, bringing stakeholders into the process. But I would also hear the other side. How can we meet you there so that you can use our research?
Right. That's great. Yeah. Hopefully we can engage in some of that conversation. Okay, so one last question that I want to touch on, and this comes from our colleague at the City of Toronto in the Environment and Climate Division, Dave McLeod. So Dave, hi, and so he could actually answer that question about how to engage with this. And Dave, we're thankful too, because he was an advisor when we selected these projects. So Dave asks, it's a hard question. So you ready? What do you think about a major insurance company offering to develop an AI tool that would identify physical climate risks in a particular city? Do you have concerns about for-profit organizations knowing where not to invest or insure an area because it's high risk?
Absolutely. I think like the dangers of technology is very much they're not aligned to our values. And I think that's why we need oversight and we need regulation so that they work for the public good.
I think I can answer. My husband actually works in life insurance, so this is an ongoing concern in my house. Like, oh, why do you need that information? Yeah, and it's hard because it's a bit inevitable in like a way, right? They're gonna continue, as we continue to obtain information, I'm sure that they will, but I think, I think there needs to be policy in place. Similar with health insurance, like we have rules about pre-existing conditions, and I think we could do something in line with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, the insurance industry is very kind of very interested in these questions of climate change and, particularly around a flood, right, and that sort of thing. So I think it is inevitable, so it's gonna happen. So I personally am not kind of collaborating with insurance companies, but I know there are climate scientists who are working with insurance companies to make sure that, as I mentioned earlier, that, climate models aren't kind of used for purposes that they weren't really designed for example. So how can we kind of think of things in terms of risk by taking all the limitations and uncertainties of these models into account? But yeah, the insurance companies or the insurance industry is moving faster sometimes than the climate community is comfortable with. Yeah, I think there's just ongoing dialogue that needs to continue, but it's for sure a concern. Mm-hmm.
And it sounds like a very similar problem that we already know, for example, redlining, but it's now simply amplified by the technology. And I think we currently do have solutions. We know how to push back. So I think that it's not a completely new problem. I think it's being magnified, and we have harder to prevent it.
Great. Thank you all for the wonderful questions, and thank you to our local panelists. And now we're going to move to our international guest. And Priyanka, if you want to stand at the podium, that's fine too, whatever you're most comfortable.
I guess because I'm here.
Okay. Okay.
Wow. What a panel, what a range of issues discussed. I feel very lucky to be able to respond to everything that has been said so far. I've learned a lot. So first of all, I want to say that in my experience, when cities talk about climate change adaptation actions, most of these actions have mostly been involved around the protection of material assets from potential climate disasters. So I want to appreciate that this panel is sort of changing that framing and bringing in change as a public health crisis, because I think this framing is important to shift us from thinking about material assets to sort of, context-specific human vulnerabilities. I think understanding the health impacts of climate change is also very important because it allows the public and policymakers to actually see the impacts of climate change is very powerful. So I use this opportunity to talk a little bit about my own work in Denver, Colorado. So I have been doing similar work in Denver to sort of stress the health impacts of climate change using health impact assessments. So in the United States, decision makers often evaluate the effectiveness of policies using tools such as health impact assessments or HIAs. most of the estimates of health in these analyses tend to be at the county level. And most recently, I've been working with US EPA, CDPHE, the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, and community groups to evaluate how the spatial scale of the HIA can actually impact the results obtained. So in Colorado, we found that when using block-level mortality rates instead of county-level mortality rates, all of a sudden we found hotspots, hotspots that the county-level analysis aggregated over, which was very important because actually this work was spurred by real community concerns in this specific census tract around an oil refinery called Suncor. And so we actually tried to respond to these community concerns by working with regulators and the city agency to sort of get the health data at a more spatially resolved scale. They'd have to go through all kinds of discussions about privacy, et cetera, to make sure that the data that we made public could not be used to sort of identify specific populations. At the same time, our data showed what we all know, that communities with a high percentage of Black and non-white residents had the highest sort of mortality rates. And this is actually a thing that I have seen in the public health literature in terms of the way we frame the results that we obtain. During COVID, there was a lot of work showing that it was Black and minoritized communities who were most impacted by COVID, and the language used in many of these research articles sort of stigmatized these groups. And so another thing that we have been trying to do is to actively shift our discussion from racism to structuralism and show that when we frame the problem in this way, we are minimizing sort of the stigmatization of this community. And I think as researchers, this is something that we have to think about very carefully. So coming back to the health impact assessment that we did in Colorado, again, as I said, we're using block level data instead of county level data. It's not open data, but it was data that we felt was important for this specific community. We found that one hotspot was actually the community, as I said, living near the oil and gas refinery operated by Suncor. And this was in Adams County, just outside Denver. The community sort of expected this. This was not surprising. And they were sort of, they wanted to use, and they are leveraging our study to battle the renewing of Suncor's permit. And speaking of which, as we have been working with them, we realized that our study was important, but I also think we need to do more work to interrogate how the data and the tools that we develop are used effectively in policy making. For example, we were not the first to show that the health outcomes experienced by communities around this refinery were bad. And indeed, the cancer rates are among the worst in the US. Why then, how then, has Suncor been able to renew their permit again and again and again? And so to answer this question, we think that this is the next step. This is the most important step in this work. So we've been working with a community organization around Suncor to actually understand how Suncor has been able to use tools in the law to renew their permit. An example of this is them classifying accidents as unusual events that are beyond the regulatory regime. And by the way, accidents at Suncor happen almost weekly. So we think that just producing this data is not enough. Understanding how this data is leveraged or not leveraged is equally important. I really appreciate the work being done by this panel on mapping out heat and air pollution and specifically at the impacts of these risks on vulnerable populations. I think this data is very policy relevant and can be used to determine things such as the location of cooling centers. It can be used to aid in the development of interventions to reduce air pollution in at-risk communities. I just think this work is incredibly important. I want to say a little bit about my own work in the US. And I'm an air quality person, so all of my examples are going to be pollution related. So we just had a paper out in the New England Journal of Medicine that developed air pollution exposure response curves. We used all of that individual level data from the Medicare population that the panelists have been talking about to sort of evaluate the impacts of different levels of air pollution on premature mortality in the Medicare population for different racial and income groups. And we found that lowering the air quality standards, something that is being discussed right now at US EPA, which to us made this work extremely policy relevant, would have the biggest benefit for Black populations, thus making the case that it is incredibly important to reduce pollution for this vulnerable subpopulation. And I think even though we understand the health impacts, doing science that is policy relevant, even if it's reinforcing what we already know, is very important because it matters in the regulatory process. I also want to say that when we think about disparities in pollution, most recently, we have recently started factoring in people's mobility in estimating exposures to various environmental health risks. For example, in the US, we used a census product called Loads, which gives you the home and workplace location for a large fraction of the US population to evaluate what happens to disparities exposures when we consider work in addition to residential locations. There has been some research that has posited that when one considers mobility, the disparities experienced in residential locations will be aggregated away. But in fact, we found that factoring in workplace locations actually accentuates air pollution disparities observed when only residential locations are considered. Why is this important? We try to argue for a more holistic look at factors of structural racism that have created these disparities. It's not just residential segregation. Could it be workplace segregation as well? Could it be access to transport? How do we as public health and urban planning scholars translate these findings more broadly to policymakers and argue for more radical change? Okay, so I'm an air quality scientist, and I love mapping and measuring pollution. I also love citizen science, but I want to say that I don't believe citizen science is the answer. For example, we looked at one of the most widely used low-cost air quality monitors in the US called the Purple Air. There's 17,000 of these monitors compared to about 6,000 US EPA monitors measuring fine particulate matter. We looked at where these Purple Air monitors were, and we actually found that they were in more white, more educated, less polluted areas than even the US EPA monitors. I say that although citizen science can be very useful to raise public awareness, etc., we have to be careful about who has access to these tools and how we use and what it means when we use data from these monitors. So, I am a scientist. I love data. I love doing epidemiologic research. However, I am also deeply committed, as clearly our other panelists are, to see that the science that we do effectively translate into the policy action our cities so desperately need. And to this end, instead of just discussing data, I want to build off on what Lief said about data infrastructures, because I think this is as important. What kinds of data infrastructures do we need to make the data we collect meaningful? How should we present our data? In what format? What visualizations should we use to make our data matter? An extreme example of this came up when I worked for UN Environment in Nairobi. Back in 2014, we looked around and we found that there was no publicly available official air quality data, and that actually started me on a long path to make use of low-cost sensors and satellite data to fill in these data gaps. However, as I kept working, I started finding amazing research already done by Kenyan researchers on air pollution in the country. And yes, these studies were and yes, they used different instruments. Many were published in local and regional journals, but at the same time, they had consistent findings on key sources of pollution. And so I realized that in addition to real-time data, we also needed better data infrastructures to make the work that has already been done visible to policymakers. And so to this end, I took up a grunt job working for the World Health Organization on just updating their source apportionment database, because I think work doing reviews is almost as important, or even more so, than collecting new data. So I'm going to end by saying that numerical data and science is important, But other data matters too, such as people's experience of these environmental health risks, such as why policies fail or are ineffective. And so with a student at the University of Colorado, Denver, we've been doing work trying to understand why, despite the approval of various state implementation plans to reduce ozone levels in Colorado since 2009, the Front Range has been out of compliance with ozone standards for 15 years. And we've been interviewing policymakers to demystify this regulatory process. We've also been looking at the literature to see what other people have found out about the SIP process, and we're pretty stunned. Despite these state implementation plans, or SIPs, being the key mechanism proposed in the Clean Air Act to get county non-compliance into compliance, there is very little out there about why SIPs work or why they fail. And we think part of the reason is that these SIPs are highly technical processes that require an understanding of air pollution models, which non-scientists find difficult to understand. So I think as scientists, we should also see our roles as sort of trying to explain what is going. I see my role as trying to explain what is going wrong in the SIP process and putting the data I generate in the form of interviews out there to hopefully inspire similar work in other states in the US and other countries to better understand why the efficacy of different policy and governance styles are higher or lower in different places. So I'm going to end by saying that data is important. Data infrastructures are important too. And I can't wait to see what the University of Toronto School of Cities does next. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Priyanka. Let's give a hand. Thank you for reminding us that climate change is a public health crisis. Thank you for reminding us we need to use a structural racism lens to avoid deficit types of framings. Thank you for reminding us of the importance of science and holistic thinking and considering who's represented and communicating. So, and I see all those ideas reflected in all of our work here, our researchers, our wonderful research at the University of Toronto. So a hand for the whole panel. And now Lara will tell us what to do next.
Thank you, everyone. Echoing Karen's thanks to all of you, and Karen included, for stepping in and moderating at the last minute. That was awesome. We're all going to have a short break, and I encourage you during this. I think you heard a lot of things about dream data sets, about technological systems and infrastructures, about stakeholders who can ground the work in community and aligning that with our values and ethics. So I know there are people in this room that have access to those very things, and I encourage you during this break to talk about them together. We'll be back in 15 minutes. Thank you.